All right, we're here for the next segment of the weekly Sonneteer. And I thought today we would go way back in time and actually read a sonnet by Shakespeare, which, as we've talked about, one of the two most famous, one of the two most popular classical forms of a sonnet is the Shakespearean sonnet. It was named after him. And so I thought today we would go back and actually look at one of Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare is well known, among other things, for this long sequence of sonnets he wrote, which were written to an unknown lover. Although some people have argued it may have even been a son of his that had died that he wrote them to. But I think most people think it was to a lover, to a mistress, whoever. And so it's kind of a famous sonnet sequence. And Shakespeare didn't title his sonnets, and so we just title them by their number usually, or by the first line of the sonnet. So this sonnet that we're looking at today, which again the link is right there under the video if you want to read along as I go, it's Sonnet 18. And I'll read it for you. It says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." I'll read it again. Like I said, I would suggest you always read a poem at least twice, maybe 3 or 4 times. I always do. Okay. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." Now, as I look at this sonnet, structurally looking at it, it's all in iambic pentameter. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." And it just goes through that way. You've got very traditional style here. Of course, when you're the person who invented the style, it would be pretty traditional. The rhyme scheme is straight up Shakespearean. Imagine that. You've got day and May, which is your A, and then temperate and date. Although it's kind of a what we would call a slant rhyme. A slant rhyme is where the sound is not quite the same, but it's spelled the same way. Or maybe the spelling is different, but the sound is the same. And so you have temperate, and then you have date, okay? And there's still the ATE ending on both of those, but it's a bit off. It's a bit slanted, because the sound's not quite the same. Then you've got shines, declines, dimmed, trimmed, fade, shade, oest, growest, and see thee. And so if we go back and look at this, again, like if you were lettering the rhyme scheme, it would day would be A, would be B. So the rhyme scheme would be like A if you were to put a letter to each line, it would be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G for that last couplet. All right, so let me just work through the poem here and talk about it. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Basically, he's talking to his lover. I like to think it's a woman, that Shakespeare is attracted to, and he says, "Shall I?" Probably because I'm married, and all, and I've had that go on in my life. I've written poems to my wife and whatnot. But he says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" He's like, in other words, for the rest of this poem, I'm going to compare you physically to a summer day. He said, "You are more lovely and more temperate." In other words, you're prettier than a summer day. And temperate means like just pleasant. You're more pleasant than a summer day. If you've got temperate weather, that means pleasant weather. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves hath all too short a day. So he's like, in May's nice, but the wind blows a little too hard, and it like just shakes the buds on the flowers and stuff. And summer is just too short, Summer's lease is too short. It's over before you know it, and you're back to work or back to school, right? Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So sometimes the sun is just too hot, right? And sometimes too, the sun's complexion is dimmed because, say, a cloud will go past. And so the sun is either too hot or the sun is dim because of a cloud between you and it. You're kind of bummed out because it's a cloudy day, maybe, although some of us love cloudy days. And so he's like, the sun is not as beautiful as you, because the implication is that your face never shines too hot, and your complexion is never dimmed. It's always highly attractive. And I'm like, hey, he's being a bit naive here, right? Naively idealistic. Well, he's being over the top, right? And every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. And so he's like, everything that is beautiful eventually declines. It gets old, it withers, whether in nature or people, right? By chance, some of us die early, like there's a car accident or whatever. That's the chance, right? So some of us, our fairness, our beauty declines by chance, an accident happens, or by nature's changing course untrimmed. Old age, nature just takes away our beauty, cuts off our limbs and stuff, untrims us as we get older. So, like, this is just the way of nature, right? But now we're going to talk about you, babe. But your eternal summer shall not fade. Your summer will never end. Nor lose possession of that fair that thou owest. You, and I believe with the apostrophe there, where he's doing the shortening of the word ost, that's to make it one syllable to fit his 10-syllable scheme, which that apostrophe is one of those poetic tricks. If you're trying to write a good line of iambic pentameter and you've got too many syllables, you're like, why don't I make that grossed into one syllable by saying grossed, right? And so it's kind of this awkward thing, but that's done a lot in traditional poetry. We stick a little, stick that in there in order to shorten the word to fit our syllable count or whatever, right? So he says, by thy eternal summer shall not fade. Your summer's never going to run out, nor lose possession of that fair. And I think it would be onest here, onest, because it's her beauty. She owns it. She owns her own beauty. And he's saying, you're never going to lose your beauty. You're never going to lose your fair, attractive complexion and all. You'll always possess that. And you're like, what? I mean, she's going to grow old just like everybody else does, right? Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death is never going to brag that he's got you, that you're in the valley of the shadow of death, so to speak. Famous song from the Bible written by King David, Psalm 23. He refers to the valley of the shadow of death, right? And Shakespeare here is saying, death is never going to brag that you are that you're walking in his valley, in the valley of his shadow. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. And you're like, you're saying she's never going to die or something? When in eternal lines to time thou growest. So you're going to go for eternity. And one of the keys that starts to tip you off here is it's like, this is ridiculous, because everybody grows old, everybody dies. But that word lines, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. How is she going to maintain her beauty and her attractiveness throughout eternity? It's because as she grows older, it's going to be within the context, within the frame of these lines. And then he hits you with the couplet, which is the Shakespearean thing. And the couplet at the end, here comes the whammo, the change in perspective, the summing up. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. He's like, as long as people are breathing and have eyes and can read, they're going to be reading this poem. This poem will live on as long as there are human beings on earth who can read. And as long as they keep reading this poem, it will give life to you. And so she's never going to grow old, because here she is in this poem. And this poem Shakespeare's got a bit of an ego here. He's like, people are always going to be reading this poem. And you will never grow old because of it. And I like, it's funny. It sounds, so there you go, right? That's the trick of the sonnet, which comes in the last two lines where he's like, this is actually what I'm talking about. I realize everybody grows old and dies, some people die young, but not you, because you are now in this poem and people will always read it. And it's kind of like, how did Shakespeare know people would always read this poem? How did Shakespeare know that, hundreds of years later, we would be sitting here reading this poem? And I think you could say it's cocky, he was just being egotistical, or you could say he knew, that he knew he was going to be the greatest English poet of all time, right? And so maybe he had an intuition, or maybe he was just being cocky and he got lucky and everybody's still reading Shakespeare. You can decide that for yourself. All right. Thank you for hopping on here, and I will see you next week.